Counterterrorism Today. Up-to-date analysis with Dan Diker.
Welcome to Counterterrorism Today. I'm Dan Diker, a research fellow here at the International Institute for Counterterrorism and the head of the Political Warfare Program and BDS, the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. Boy, this is a critical moment in the Middle East, and it is no less an important discussion with leading experts on Israel and its neighbors. We're going to call this program Israel and its Neighbors in the Middle Eastern Terror Maze: War, Peace, or Containment. Now, that's just the organizing principle to give our dear audience a sense of perspective and point of reference. What we want to share with you is, just before I introduce our very distinguished guest, is that we have a new neighbor in town. It's a big neighbor. It's the Russian bear. And Russia doesn't seem to be going anywhere. They're staying for the long term right here in the Middle East, focusing first and foremost in Syria. And the question is, what influence does Russia have as looked like a temporary neighbor, now a permanent neighbor? And as my colleague sitting across from me, Dr. Hayim Iserovich, said, it's the known unknown new neighbor, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. Let me introduce our in-studio guest. We're very honored to have Dr. Hayim Iserovich. Dr. Iserovich is the foreign affairs reporter for the Israeli daily Ma'ariv newspaper, and he also is a columnist for the paper, writing on security and global terrorism. So we're delighted to have you, Hayim. Welcome. And then we have two other scholars of the Middle East with us by phone. They're here locally, but not in studio. Let me welcome, first of all, Meir Javedanfar, who is really one of the leading authorities in Israel on Iran, himself an Iranian-Israeli scholar, and he is an adjunct lecturer in contemporary Iranian politics right here at the Lauder School of Government, Diplomacy and Strategy at the IDC, which is the International Disciplinary Center, Herzliya, which is where our studios are right now. You listen carefully to what Mr. Javedanfar has to say. He is not only from a cultural and linguistic point of view, but as an Iranian-Israeli, he has his finger on the pulse of what is happening in the Islamic Republic of Iran and throughout the region. And right next to him, virtually, is Dr. Nir Boms, who is one of the most serious scholars and experts on Syria and the Middle East here in Israel and in the region, has relationships with all kinds of very interesting political, diplomatic, and security actors in Syria and in the region. Dr. Boms is a research fellow here at the ICT, and he is also a research fellow at the Dayan Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Tel Aviv University. Welcome, Dr. Boms. Great to have you with us.
Good to be here.
So, gentlemen, I'm going to open up, if you would, the two of you by phone, just hang in there just for a moment. I'm just going to turn to Dr. Iserovich, and let's talk about, let's launch our very focused discussion here on the Middle East terrorism maze, Israel's position, and then the new neighbor in town. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu goes to the Black Sea resort and has his 7th meeting in 2 years, more than with American political leadership in the last 2 years. And what is the urgency of the meeting, and why does it matter right now?
Well, it's true. The 7th meeting, we can't remember any prime minister who met so many times with American president. But the urgency right now is the situation near the border, near the Syrian border. Russia and the US, and actually Russia, maintain regions of regions to contain the fighting in Syria in order to move on to the end of the civil war. And Israel is very afraid, very concerned that the Iranian, Hezbollah, the Iranian, are going to be right here near our border in the Golan. And the reason for this urgent meeting was to show President Putin intelligence documents and everything that shows how much serious threat it is. Because right now we have the Hezbollah in the north, in Lebanon. Near the Golan, there were some clashes, as we know. And Iran all over Iraq. And suddenly we have Iranian IRGC here near our border. Since, as you said, Russia is the new neighbor, the new godfather of Syria.
The new godfather, the new sheriff in town, in a sense.
Yeah,
so let me just turn to Nir Boms, for example, and let me just take what Hayim Iserovich said and say. So Israel's very concerned about two things. One, we have Iranian Revolutionary Guard operatives right over Israel's northern border on the Syrian side of the Golan Heights, and it doesn't seem, Dr. Boms, that the President Putin was overly concerned about Prime Minister Netanyahu's warnings, his urgings to end Iran and fellow Hezbollah proxies' presence within eyesight, naked eyesight of Israel's border.
Well, then I'm not sure that we really understand whether President Putin was overly concerned or not. I mean, I think some of it still remains to be seen. The nature of these meetings and these relationships is not just about public statements or various leaks, attributed or not, that come afterwards, but really about the actions on the ground. But if we zoom out, we speak about a new emergent status quo that begins to take shape in Syria. And if we were to look at the status quo that has been in existence for quite some time before the Syrian war began, Syria was indeed connected to Russia. It was connected to Iran. It served as a very important source for Hezbollah. It hosted a number of terrorist groups, but it also tried to stay out directly from the arena of confrontation. It had assisted Hezbollah, provided logistical support, was a pass-through country. It hosted all the Sunni organizations as well. This was a rare thing in the Middle East, to have a country that is able to work with Sunnis and Shias alike and to serve as a front and an arm of Iran, and the same token also a front and arm of many other radical Sunni organizations. But that's where it ended. The new emergent status quo is a little different, because if the Iranians are closer, if you have weapons, factories, revolutionary guards that are able to shorten the distance when it comes to bringing arms to Hezbollah, and if you have the Russians guarding with S-3 and 400 integrated defense system that is integrated with the Syrian one and limits Israel's ability to respond, then we have a new status quo that certainly is of some concern to Israel.
Meir Javedanfar, let's take what Dr. Boms has said and move it to the Iranian leadership's point of view. You know, what we heard back in 2004 from Jordan's King Abdullah is that we're seeing what he called the Shiite crescent, and we're seeing that more and more. We're hearing that more and more that the Iranian regime is succeeding to create, this bridge of direct influence on the ground from Iran to Iraq to Syria and Lebanon. So we see that crescent. Is that what's going on here? The fulfillment of that foreign policy dream, and what does the regime want with Syria and Lebanon?
Absolutely, this is what the Iranian regime has wanted, and it's achieving it. Now, to get to your question, what does the regime want? First of all, please allow me to address the fact that there are differences within Iran. The Iranian regime believes that to protect the revolution, it needs to be in Syria, not just to protect Hezbollah, but to protect the revolution in Iran. Why? Because in 2009, there was an uprising in Iran after the fraudulent re-election of President Ahmadinejad. And one of the chants was no to Gaza, no to Lebanon, my life for Iran. Basically, people were saying that we should focus on, first and foremost, on our issues in Iran and not to go around giving money to Gaza and to Lebanon. Now, the Iranian regime sees that and the people who says it as people who want to undermine its very own existence. So by being in Syria, by creating this new base in Syria, there are domestic issues that the Iranian regime is trying to address. And it's doing so by basically isolating those in Iran who believe that we should first and foremost focus on the domestic issues in Iran. The Iranian regime believes that those people in Iran want the Islamic Republic to become more republic and to become more normalized, and that could mean the end of the Islamic Revolution. And the Iranian regime believes that to counter that, we need to stay revolutionary. And how do we stay revolutionary? By being in Syria, by confronting the state of Israel and America's allies in that region. So there is a difference, but in Iran, the revolutionaries and the regime institutions close to the supreme leader have a bigger say, and they are there because they want to also expand their reach within the region, because this is what Khamenei wants, and this is what gets the military and economic power inside Iran, first and foremost, but it also protects Hezbollah, but last but not least, it opens a new flank against Israel.
So we have, we here really have a double-headed monster in the north. We've got we have a Syrian front, we have a Lebanese front. Hayim, Dr. Iserovich, let's share with our listeners, our professional audiences, colleagues at the ICT and others, friends and the general public, about what we know as Israel's red line security policy. Many people are unaware, and I'm really addressing this to you as well as to Dr. Boms, as well as to Meir Javedanfar, that Israel has, according to foreign news sources, bombed Syria, Lebanese Hezbollah transfers, Iranian Hezbollah transfers of balance-breaking weaponry and other military assets, scores of times, many more than people.
I don't think it's only foreign sources. The head of the Israeli Air Force, the former head of the Israeli Air Force, said that last week to the Haaretz. That's with
to the newspaper. He came out publicly so that we can say it. So what we're saying to our listeners is that Israel is being looked at by many in the region as a pretty tough little country, having not spoken too much, but actually bombing a radical Islamic Republic of Iran transfers of weaponry and other military assets through civilian aircraft in Damascus airport, through to Syria, into the rest of Syria, as well as in Lebanon. What kind of a message does Israel's what looks like a very tough steel military policy, what kind of a message does that send out in terms of creating deterrence?
I think the message, and the Defense Minister Lieberman said that it's also this week, that we cannot let these arms shipments to continue, to bring more lethal and balance-breaking weapon to Hezbollah. And I think it's also meant to the Russian ear to understand that, okay, you're here, but we have our interest, we have our red lines. This is our security. So if we have to act, we will act, even if you're here. And so far, so good, the Russians. But we see all the S-400 and all the anti-aircraft. And the question is, how much the Russian let loose the whoop to Israel?
See, this is a critical point that Dr. Iserovich brings up. Nir Boms, can you jump in here? We are looking on the one hand at a policy of I guess I don't know if we can call Russia an ally, but certainly a friend at this point, a country amenable to Israel's security needs on the one hand. On the other hand, as Hayim Iserovich points out, it could quickly metastasize into an adversarial relationship, and some say even bring the two sides to the possible brink of armed conflict. What is your sense of this very, very fragile dynamic between Russia as the local sheriff in town and a superpower, and Israel as sort of the local, with a local red line security policy for the Jewish state?
Dan, the very dynamic that you describe is really the reason for the intense relationship that we described before, with meetings, 7 different meetings in person, and many more conversations between the Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Putin, and add to that a very effective, I think so far, military coordination mechanism that had so far survived not an easy period. As we discussed, the Air Force Chief, General Eshel, said that in the last 5 years, Israel bombed over about 100 times Syrian convoys. And of course, this was done relatively recently as well, and this is done under the watchful eye of the Russians, who now have radars and the systems, S-3 and 400, that are able to actually see every plane from the point of departure in Ramat David or elsewhere in northern Israel. So that's why this mechanism is important. I will say, one more thing about this issue of the red lines. The red lines were created first and declared by Minister of Defense at the time, Ya'alon, in 2013. And Israel basically said, look, we understand that this Syrian conflict is progressing, advancing, and it's also getting closer to us. We're not going to tolerate that it's penetrating our own border, and we will respond any times when it will happen. Second, we're not going to tolerate the types of forces that are far from friendly to us, that are coming closer, and we'll try to prevent that. And third, we're not going to tolerate the growth and armament of Hezbollah, particularly in weapons that are more strategic, either non-conventionals or just long-term missiles. And that explains the activities. None of this could have happened without the mechanism, with the Russians. And I think that as the situation changes and as a new status quo is being, gradually put in place, this particular mechanism and the relationships are very important. And they're important because Israel needs to ensure a certain degree of maneuverability, of freedom of action to continue to respond to situations where Hezbollah is getting weapons. We know that the Iranians are very active on that front. And Israel needs to make sure that they're able to do that without colliding with the Russians. And I think part of the conversation is, okay, so who is guarding these interests? And perhaps the Russians are saying to Israel, well, look, we know, we understand, we will do our part so the Iranians are not going to damage your interest. And Israel is saying, well, we are taking a very watchful eye there, and if we need to respond, we need to respond. And I think that's what they were trying to figure out. So far, the system had worked. Whether the system is not going to work in the future, I think it's going to be very precarious and very dangerous, and I think that the two leaders are probably doing the best they can to make sure that this type of collaboration will actually continue.
Meir Javedanfar, it looks like the Russians, that President Putin and the Iranian regime leadership are pretty friendly these days. It looks like it's a solid. It looks like it's a pretty solid alliance. Get behind that. How strong is the alliance, and how do you see the Iranian interests and the Russian interests working either to strengthen that alliance or at some point to allow it to break?
Well, it's a complicated relationship. They both serve each other's interests. The Iranians don't trust the Russians entirely, and the Russians don't trust the Iranians entirely, but they have a very convenient relationship. We expect the Russians to expel the Iranians. Well, that's from an Israeli point of view, it's very understandable. We don't want Iran on our northern border in Syria. But Dan, who is going to give the Russians 20,000 ground forces? Which other country is going to provide 20,000 militia on the ground so they get killed and not Russian soldiers? So for now, what I'm trying to say is that Iran, as much as there have been differences and they don't trust each other, Iran serves a very important purpose for Russia in Syria. in that it's providing militia on the ground who are doing a lot of the groundwork, the ground fighting work, the infantry kind of work, and on the front lines. And this enables Putin to avoid casualties, which the Russian public is sensitive to. And at the same time, where is Iran going to get an air force as good as Russia to attack some of these militants in Syria? It's not. The Iranian air force is very outdated because of the many embargoes, and some of the aircraft it has received after the revolution are not frontline type aircraft. So Iran is getting support, air support, from Putin, and this is what turned around the war for Iran, not the nuclear deal. The air power of Putin saved Iran and Assad and Hezbollah. So, it's a very convenient relationship, but I think we have to, in terms of the strength, to provide a strength test, to test the strength of this relationship, we have to wait until once the Syrian war is over or it's close to being over. I think that's where we're going to see major differences between Iran and Russia.
Meir Javedanfar, the Iranian regime has always thrived on chaos in different parts of the world. It looks like when we look at the situation in Syria, that the regime would be very pleased as to what's happened here with Russian intervention and so many different moving parts between tensions between Israel and Turkey and Iran, and then there's the Kurdish question, which we haven't addressed yet, and local militias in Syria. I mean, this seems like a perfect storm for the Iranians.
For now, it is, yes, Dan. Yeah. For now, temporarily. We have to wait and see what happens when the war is over. But the Iranians have, they made a very good decision by sending Qasem Soleimani, the head of the IRGC, to ask Putin to send his air force. This wasn't an easy decision, asking a Christian country and a foreign superpower to come and bomb Muslim people in Syria. But, to serve in the Iranian constitution, it's more important to save the Islamic Republic than a mosque. You can bulldoze a mosque. You can forget about, you can basically cancel prayers. Anything is eligible in order to save the Islamic Republic. But Dan, if I can just add one point quickly.
Please.
The Iranians, if they make a strategic mistake, they could also, in Syria could turn into one of the biggest and most costly mistakes after the Islamic Republic. And that could be if they use Syria to launch attack against Israel. In the next war between Hezbollah and Israel, if they are not careful, that war could extend directly into Iran and directly into Tehran.
Mm-hmm. You mean from the point of view of the Western Alliance and together with perhaps Sunni Arab countries?
I think your guest in the studio can tell us more, but let's just put it this way. Hezbollah has 120,000 missiles. Let's say they fire 80,000 missiles at us. In the last war, they fired 4,000. So this time they'll be able to fire 20 times more missiles. So out of that 80,000 missiles, let's say we stop 40,000 of them. 40,000 missiles landing on Israel, there will at least be 5,000 dead Israelis. And I think in such a scenario, the prospect of war, of a direct attack against Tehran will increase immeasurably. And I think there will be people in Israel who are against attacking the Iran's nuclear installation who will back attacking Iran in such a scenario.
Hayim Iserovich, what do you think about that? I mean, this very fragile balance of power, and just what Meir Javedanfar just said, the likelihood or the possibility that it can lead to a real regional war against Iran.
It's true. I don't think it's out of...
it's not a fantasy.
It's not a fantasy. It can happen, of course, and I think everybody does want such a scenario. Not in Israel, or not in Hezbollah, not in Lebanon government, not in Iran. They know that not only Israel is going to bomb, the American have the aircraft carrier in the Persian Gulf and everything. So it's going to be, if we speak right now about the Korean crisis, this can be also not a small crisis, not a smaller crisis than what happened in Korea.
It raises the fact. It raises the question of the Americans who haven't gone into the extraordinarily. When we talk about superpowers in the Middle East, Israel and its neighbors, and the terrorism maze, the United States had never come up in this discussion in the last 20 minutes. Extraordinarily.
Yeah.
What about the United States? You just mentioned they're all tied up now with the North Korean firing of a missile over their Japanese neighbor. Where does it bring the United States into this whole calculus? Because they, as Nir Boms pointed out before we went on air, the United States is really looking at the Middle East in the Trump administration in a way as a continuation of the tactical anti-terror view that the Obama administration had taken of the Middle East,
right.
not to commit too many boots on the ground and to be a strategic player, but more of a tactical support.
I think one example to see how the American role changed, let's go back 26 years ago to the Madrid conference. The American organized it, and they took the Russian by politely. It was the end of the Soviet Union, and the Russian were a partner, but not the major one. But right now, I think the Americans are waiting that the Russian will tell them when they can go in. The Americans were part of the discussion about the situation near the Golan in South Syria a few weeks ago. But besides the war against ISIS, Al-Qaeda in Syria, we don't hear the American. It's true. And that shows that the Russians are the sheriffs of this area right now. And the American can play a role, but it's so much minor role compared to, 10 years, 20 years ago.
But I want to ask a question to you and also to Nir Boms and Meir Javedanfar, and that is, if this conflict turns towards Tehran as a more a traditional state-to-state conflict, not only perceived as a large or small or a large anti-counterterrorism operation, would that bring the United States in as a military player?
If there's going to be some armed conflict between Israel and Iran, I think the American will be there. I think that if you hear, at least if it's during the Trump president, you could hear President Trump speak about the commitment to the security in Israel more than he speak about the commitment to the security of Japan or South Korea, even if he speak about it. And I think that's an armed conflict between Israel and Iran. The American won't sit aside and look what happened.
Nir Bom, your sense of the situation that we just heard from Hayim Iserovich?
Well, we can remind ourselves that an indirect conflict between Israel and Iran existed for quite some time, and every time when we have a conflict with Hezbollah, with the scenario that Meir so aptly described, this is a conflict with Iran. And that's part of the conflict with Syria as a conflict with Iran. And we have, in some parts of this 100 raids and bombings in Syria, we've ended up killing very senior Iranian officials. So that scenario is there. But I think because of that, there's also that if you're looking at the balance of interests, I don't think that either Russians or the Americans would like to create another conflagration. There's enough that it's hand right now, and enough that can go out of hands if this continues. So it's a very thin and tight balance, and the balance is at this point is not necessarily serving Israel's interest, but this is part of the reality of where things go. In terms of the Americans, we have seen a little bit more assertiveness when President Trump assumed office. A little, we've seen, the bombing following the Khan Shaykhun chemical attack. We have seen more troops sort of coming to the region. But soon enough, we also heard that the Americans are stopping the collaboration with some of the factions of the oppositions, that they're responding to the Russian requests. and the Jordanians are taking a few steps back, and really they are adopting this sort of more tactical view of, we're fighting ISIS and get done with it. And if that's the case, again, it really means that if we're going to try to prevent a more serious confrontation, with Iran, then the Russians will have to hold the weight, and the Americans will continue to sort of lead from behind.
Meir Javedanfar, the last time there was the possibility of some sort of, the word overthrow is a strong word, but an internal shift of power from the Iranian people was in 2009 when the Iranian people went into the streets against the regime. The Americans did not pick up the ball and support the popular resistance against the regime. Do you see a scenario here in which, with all of this fragility that Iran has created and supported for itself, that we could be going into another scenario where where we had a security authority here for many years, Uri Lubrani, who's now retired, who said that the best way to topple the Iranian regime is from the inside, because the vast majority of people are pro-Western, pro-freedom. Are we looking at a situation that can evolve into that type of internal change of power?
Not at the moment, Dan, unless there's an unexpected explosion of demonstration brought about by the current economic difficulties. For example, there were recently demonstrations of Air Force personnel in Iran there were delays in they hadn't paid them, and there were some factory workers in Iran who the regime was late in paying them by a number of months, and they were so poor, some of them were advertising selling their kidneys. The situation is getting worse, but it's extremely difficult to predict an explosion of demonstrations unless there's an unpredictable one. The only scenario which could pose a security threat to the stability of the regime is the question of drought in Iran and population migration.
I see. And finally, Nir Boms, just to throw in, we haven't talked about the Syrian Kurds, even though that's getting a lot more play in the international media, and it's been my view as an analyst on this issue for 7 or 8 years, and I know you've been deeply involved with it, that the Kurds can create a real beachhead for security for the Western alliance and alliance against ISIS and against Hezbollah, Iran, Syria. How serious a security asset can they be, and how realistic is it to see the emergence of either an independent Syrian Kurdistan or an autonomous area that has teeth and strong security sense?
Of the regional alliance in the context of the interest of Israel, the United States, Jordan, the Kurds are very much part and parcel of the programmatic side. Overall, they've also proven to be more reliable in terms of their fighting ability. We have not seen, so many cases of Kurdish defects to the other side, or their weapons coming to them, reaching, ISIS, as we have seen, unfortunately, a growing number of reports when it comes to the other American-led programs, and therefore the Americans have made a choice to work with the SDP, but really mostly with the Kurds. The democratic forces, SDF, are largely comprised of Kurds. At the same token, the Kurds in Syria are different than the Kurds in northern Iraq, where we're about to have a referendum and perhaps a state sooner rather than later. And in Syria, it's a bit more complicated because of issues of sovereignty and because of other interests of the other parties. If they're going to have an autonomy, as they, to some degree, de facto have at the moment, then yes, it's certainly going to be able to keep ISIS and other elements out, and they may be able to project pragmatism and moderation from the kind that certainly the allies in the West would like to see. The Turks, of course, are not very happy about this. And I think also the Russians are not happy with the idea of dividing Syria really. They're happy to have a region of influence and certain degree of autonomy in order to, divide and conquer and balance between the interests. And for Israel, unfortunately, the Kurds are far away. I think if you ask many Israelis if the Kurds would have been our neighbor, I think we would be happy to have them, closer to us rather than closer to Turkey. Perhaps the Kurds would even have a similar choice. But unfortunately, they are far away, so therefore we need to deal with our neighbors from the south, whoever they may be.
There we have it. Well, it looks like it's the alliance of moderates, pragmatists, defending themselves versus extremism and radicalism in the Middle East. As Nir Boms said, it's Israel fighting the United Nations of terror in Syria. I think it sums it up very well. I want to thank all three of our experts here, Dr. Hayim Iserovich, the foreign affairs reporter and columnist for Ma'ariv, Dr. Nir Boms, a research fellow here at ICT, as well as at the Dayan Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Tel Aviv University, and of course, Meir Javedanfar, also with the ICT and an adjunct professor and lecturer here on Iranian politics at the Lauder School of Government in the International Disciplinary Center, Herzliya. I'm Dan Diker. This is Counterterrorism Today. Hope we've helped your understanding of this very complicated maze of terror here in the Middle East. Israel standing strong and trying to put up a front of security and trying to protect its own freedom and the freedom of its neighbors who are now much more amenable to Israel than in the past. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you again soon.